Horror movies don't always have to be scary to be considered good horror films, and Freaked is an unforgettable 1993 movie full of strange things caught on camera that are fun and entertaining to watch, and so is the weird history behind the scenes of this gross-out body horror monster movie. Freaked is directed by Alex Winter, who played Bill from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures with Keanu Reeves, and that's why Keanu Reeves plays Otis the dog boy in these hilarious scenes that are like Wolfman scenes. Keanu Reeves did this right after the making of Dracula in 1992 as a favor to Alex Winter. It's pretty funny, especially since they had to put these hairs on him one strand at a time for hours. Plus there's other mutant monsters played by other celebrities from the 90s like Bobcat Goldthwait, who's a bunch of sock puppets, and Mr. T. Anyway, Alex Winter is a giant horror movie fan who's been friends with Sam Raimi, director of the Evil Dead movies, for a long time. Together they worked on an offbeat kind of 90s skit show on MTV called The Idiot Box, along with their friend Tom Stern, who directed An American Werewolf in Paris. Alex Winter and Tom Stern wanted to make one of the most brutal and savage movies of all time, and all they needed was $100,000 for the small indie film to get started. Their original idea for this monster movie was called Hideous Mutant Freaks, and they were hoping to make a low-budget horror movie directly inspired by the success of Charles Band's movies under his indie label Full Moon Features. That's why Freaked even has Megan Ward from the Full Moon Feature Transfer series if you like really low-budget campy sci-fi movies. Trancers is great. Unfortunately, no producers were interested in attaching their name to a low-budget horror movie, so Alex Winter and Tom Stern raised the budget to $12 million, and that's the price range where they have less creative control. So the producers shortened the name from Hideous Mutant Freaks to Freaked, and they toned down the more outrageous horror movie scenes, rewriting the film into more of a horror comedy and less of an over-the-top, brutal and savage movie. But that made Freaked good in a different way, and it even does weird stuff like spoofing movies like Twilight Zone and Airplane. And funny enough, Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine, like those clownish yet somewhat creepy drawings that have almost photographic level detail, was an inspiration for how people looked in this movie. So even though it's not entirely what they wanted to do as indie filmmakers, they still got something really cool. Like this stop motion horror animation from Freaked was done by David Daniels, who also worked on the Idiot Box and that MTV show Liquid Television from the 90s. That's a bizarre series. And the other experimental stop motion animation sequences were done by the Kyoto brothers, who worked on some of my favorite horror movies ranging from Gremlins to underrated horror sci-fi gems like Critters and Screamers. All great sci-fi horror movies. They even did the stop motion animation that horrified everyone for years with Large Marge and Big Top Kiwi. Plus, finally, they have David Allen, who did the stop-motion horror in The Howling and the Twilight Zone movie. Freaked had a lot of behind-the-scenes talent and momentum, and it was intended to be a big hit and make a lot of money, but it flopped really bad and made less than $30,000 on a $12 million budget. While Freaked is not a made-for-television horror movie, the cult classic following came mostly from seeing this movie on TV throughout the 90s. It's also why it became one of those, like, what is the name of this tip-of-your-tongue horror comedy movies. I think Hideous Mutant Freaks is more of a memorable title, and nobody can remember Randy Quaid was in this movie. Poor Randy Quaid. Parents is another great Quaid horror movie that gets overlooked, by the way. Like so many other cult classic horror movies, Freaked 1993 is not available streaming online, but it's definitely a horror comedy to watch out for because there are some physical copies out there. Best known for their British zombie movie Shaun of the Dead, horror comedy duo Simon Pegg and Nick Frost return in The World's End, a 2013 end-of-the-world sci-fi horror film that's different than most alien invasion movies and a forgotten gem if you like post-apocalyptic horror movies that are funny. Horror fans who remember Simon Pegg and Nick Frost might not realize they're actually a British filmmaking trio, the third friend being Edgar Wright, director of Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz in The World's End, and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Together, the three of them have been making horror movies and other projects for decades. Best of all, for this apocalypse movie, Edgar Wright had made quite a name for himself by now. He was able to pick up some big names for the making of The World's End. This sci-fi flick has the same director of photography as The Matrix, believe it or not, Bill Pope, and it has kung fu style fight scenes choreographed by Brad Allen, who worked on the Jackie Chan movies. In one scene in The World's End, Pierce Brosnan puts on a glowing guest cameo, and Bill Nye voices the leader of the alien invasion.
It is true.
Movies like this are weird weird and fun. It's entertaining sci-fi cosmic horror that doesn't take itself very seriously, but the camera work and everything else is top notch. The World's End uses a very old-fashioned, hand-cranked 16mm camera for the beginning of the movie, and then it switches to 35mm for the rest of the film. This was pretty rare for horror movies in 2013, as most films by then were digital. The traditional footage allowed them to do some conventional lighting tricks that look great, including some horror scenes that are like a tongue-in-cheek tribute to Dario Argento and his Italian horror movies. Some behind-the-scenes information about this movie: they used stuntmen who are already missing an arm or a leg so they could literally pull them off, and the horror CGI effects in this movie still look fantastic. Nick Frost accidentally knocked out a stuntman with a stool during the making of this memorable horror comedy scene. Edgar Wright was able to film this first all in his head, and then everything was caught on camera in 12 weeks after a lot of pre-rehearsal. Every camera angle, and this is what I like about him as a director, was accounted for down to the last dollar. He's like a perfectionist filmmaker, best known for not leaving a horror scene alone until everything is exactly right. He says this is one of his only films where all of the sci-fi horror movie moments were exactly correct, and even Peter Jackson, who he's friends with, said he was genuinely impressed with this movie. The only thing that didn't cooperate with the making of The World's End was the weather. It kept raining, and all these stuntmen had to run full speed across these slick cobblestone while wearing these lights on their head to look like alien monsters. Luckily, only one of them fell and got messed up in these scenes. This film does drag a little, I guess, especially compared to most alien invasion movies, as it takes almost 50 minutes before it starts to parody Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Day the Earth Stood Still. But then it becomes more of an action sci-fi horror movie, so no complaints here. I think Shaun of the Dead is a better horror comedy if you're just looking to laugh. This movie has more serious moments and it can be horror drama at times, but if you like cosmic horror and alien invasion movies, The World's End is an end-of-the-world apocalypse movie worth renting on Amazon Prime. Repossessed is a 1990 horror comedy movie with a ridiculous script starring Leslie Nielsen from the Naked Gun and Airplane movies. An unofficial horror movie sequel to The Exorcist, Linda Blair revisits her role, this time overtaken by ghosts through the television, because this is a horror comedy parody of Poltergeist as well. By this time, Linda Blair had grown tired of being associated with her character Regan from The Exorcist, and she was happy to do a horror comedy spoof to kind of disassociate herself from this horror movie villain. It was her idea to bring along Leslie Nielsen, who is easily the best part of this horror movie. A lot of people think that Repossessed is from the same writers as Naked Gun or Airplane, but it was just Leslie Nielsen, not the writers. Although he did strongly advise more jokes about passing gas, so good call there. I like it. And as far as how this horror movie looks, the makeup artist from Beetlejuice did Linda Blair's makeup. Repossessed has the same cinematographer as the Police Academy movie, so this really does feel more like that kind of almost directionless 80s comedy movie atmosphere. The producer of Total Recall and Terminator 2 was expecting a hit from this movie, but it flopped. The horror movie only made $18 million on a $32 million budget. Part of it was because the real horror movie sequel, The Exorcist 3, came out and flopped a month before, so people were already just tired of supernatural possession movies at the time. And, you know, since it didn't have the same writers as Naked Gun or Airplane, just Leslie Nielsen, Repossessed is just kind of like a bunch of loose parody comedy skits rather than a real story. The good news is that Leslie Nielsen was one of the funniest people ever, so even his worst movies, horror or otherwise, are still pretty good. The movie did eventually get me to laugh when they started rapping about possession movies, and it does have its moments. But then it is a bad horror movie because, like, remember when Spy Hard had the parody opening song by Weird Al Yankovic? That was good, but in comparison, the opening theme for Repossessed was so bad that it won a Razzie Award. So they just kind of accidentally created a legitimately bad horror movie while trying to make a horror comedy. Leslie Nielsen also goes away in the middle of the movie because I think this film wanted to keep the budget down. So will you laugh constantly at every horror movie scene like Airplane and Naked Gun? Probably not. This horror movie wasn't even popular when it came out in the early 90s, but it's still fun and entertaining and worth taking a watch now. If you like The Exorcist or just some old Leslie Nielsen humor, you can watch Repossessed, available for rent on YouTube. This low-budget B-movie horror film, She Gods of Shark Reef, is I guess what you could call a vacation movie in the sense that it's one of two Roger Corman movies made in 1958 while he was living in Hawaii pretty much on vacation. Say what you want about the low quality of his horror movies, which I think are fun to watch, the more you learn about the making of Roger Corman movies, the more you'll like this entertaining director on like a personal level. Before he made low-budget movies under his company New World Pictures, Roger Corman made cheap movies largely financed by independent film distributors who wanted to sell his films to bigger studios. He used filmmaking as a way to not necessarily grift, because Roger Corman movies are awesome and he usually came through with a good final product, but rather to tweak the process to do cool things he wanted to do, like making two movies set in Hawaii and going to live there for a while with his filmmaking friends. He's like the Ferris Bueller of directors or something. The making of She Gods of Shark Reef marks the 21st of Roger Corman movies, close to about a third or maybe halfway through his directing career, 2 movies before the black and white creature feature The Wasp Woman, 1959, so by now he had the horror movie making routine pretty much down. The studio gave him $100,000 to film first a drama movie, Thunder Over Hawaii, in a week, and then they gave him another $50,000 to make a silly, goofy, low-budget horror drama movie, She Gods of Shark Reef, in another 7 days. The reason I like watching this bad 50s horror movie, and it is not a good horror movie, I'll put it like that, so much, is because I don't think he cared very much about making it, or at least not as much as the more expensive main film, Thunder Over Hawaii. So the film has this very 50s pulp feel where it doesn't make much sense, but it has a cool idea about these brothers getting stranded on an all-female island with strange supernatural customs, including human offerings to sharks. There's even a cheap movie statue prop at the bottom of the ocean that may or may not be supernatural in this film. Roger Corman uses stock footage for the really big sharks in this movie, but unlike most B horror, the smaller shark they are swimming with during these horror movie scenes is real. Not that I agree with the moral implications of literally capturing a wild shark caught on camera here in these scenes, but that's exactly what Roger Corman and his crew did, and that takes some real dedication. I mean, I don't think many filmmakers would be willing to go to those lengths capturing a shark to get a horror movie finished. You didn't see Spielberg out there capturing a great white shark for his B-movie Jaws. Corman was just one of those like calm and quiet type of people who could also just kind of be a wild director and do whatever it takes. So that's what I really like about Roger Corman movies more than anything. Also, this movie I think influenced the Wicker Man remake.
What's in the bag? A shark or something?
Because I know Nicolas Cage and Johnny Ramone would hang out and watch bad old horror movies together and laugh, and Roger Corman movies being their horror movie collection top choice. So anyway, you've either seen cheesy Roger Corman movies or you haven't. This movie has such a cult classic horror following that it even gets a mention in the opening of Grease. And it's not even one of Corman's legitimately good supernatural horror movies. It's a shark movie so bad it's good, but it's not his best, that's for sure. It's a shark movie with an actress also who sounds like Vincent Price with that same strange transatlantic accent.
You go there when you are hungry.
So if you like funny and entertaining old horror movies, the kind of horror film nonsense where you can see the boom mic and more weird stuff like that, then I highly recommend checking out this classic Corman movie streaming for free on Tubi. So how is the 2000s romantic comedy Knocked Up with Katherine Heigl connected with the horror icon Edgar Allan Poe? A hammed-up, low-budget 2003 horror movie called Descendant where, instead of Seth Rogen, she's dating someone related to and haunted by the ghost of Edgar Allan Poe. Yup, that's right. The ghost of Edgar Allan Poe is in this man's house and he won't stop staring. Or is he? Dun dun dun. Is all this psychological horror inside of his mind? Do both possibilities stink and make me laugh? Yes. Prepare for a spooky cinematic treat. Jeremy London from Mallrats is the horror movie villain in this weird Poe movie, and his overacting is really amazing.
Best seller.
He's making the same faces as like Tim Heidecker for any Tim and Eric fans, or really any Trevor Moore fans for that matter, since every scene is delivered like a Lost Whitest Kid You Know sketch.
He's mine.
But this is presented, keep in mind, as a serious horror drama that only super smart people who have read Poe can understand. The acting just puts us straight into fun and entertaining horror comedy territory. What really tops everything off about this silly movie was that it was written by William Catt, the actor from 80s horror films House and House 4. Those are great horror movies. He's acted in other random scary movies like Mirrors too, but he's probably best known as the prom date of Stephen King's Carrie in 1976. All better horror movies than Descendant. The horror movie was also written by Del Tenney, who made one of the worst zombie movies of the 70s. A B-movie called I Eat Your Skin that has a name that's way cooler and more fun and entertaining than anything that happens in the old black and white flick. The friend of the protagonist in this movie is played by Diane Foster, and she would do some work in a Danzig music video in his 2019 horror movie Veronica. And Edgar Allan Poe is played by the same actor as Henry the Hermit from the Cabin Fever movie. The cop in this movie is the same actor in Bride of Chucky. I really like that Chucky movie. So the point is, somehow people still manage to have careers after this forgotten horror movie was filmed. I was surprised to find this movie even had a theater release because it looks like direct-to-video horror or one of those made-for-television horror movies they play in the middle of the night, but it had a $650,000 budget, very low, and I don't think they even reported how much money this made because it probably made less. I just wanted to say again that this is supposed to be a scary movie about being related to Edgar Allan Poe and having him haunt your house and staring at you and telling you he doesn't like you.
You are becoming a parody of yourself.
If you like watching weird horror movies that are bad on purpose, then this is worth watching, ironically. But for the rest of the people who are, normal, Descendant is a really bad psychological horror movie that's luckily streaming absolutely nowhere.
The Gothic Horror Story.
Children of Men is a 2007 sci-fi movie that has this lonesome atmospheric horror exterior, yet it's somehow a light-hearted dystopian movie about the end of the world that's unlike most apocalypse movies. In other words, really weird stuff. This is a horror sci-fi movie about a recent end of the world situation where people still act somewhat normal and go to work and stuff like that, but there's no reason for them to maintain anything for future generations because no one is being born. A post-apocalyptic horror movie that almost downplays the apocalypse. So it's a slow burn horror movie at first because the main villain is like worldwide infertility. I don't know. It's a weird concept for a 1992 book by author P.D. James, and it's an equally weird concept for a horror movie. So you have that nihilistic horror movie atmosphere going on, but then you have Mrs. Trunchbull from Matilda and dreadlocks, and Michael Caine is playing air guitar and doing other fun and entertaining things. It's some weird stuff to put in a dystopian sci-fi horror movie, but the actors did a lot of improv to explore their characters and how they would react to the end of the world, so whatever strange things caught on camera stayed in the movie because of the way each scene was filmed. So director Alfonso Cuarón wanted the making of Children of Men to involve a lot of continuous scenes with absolutely no cuts whatsoever, just long single takes with tons of background choreography and this spontaneous, genuine reactions from each character. He wanted there to be very little difference between the background and the foreground for this flat overall emotionless atmospheric horror effect, and as a result a lot of the creepiest things are found hidden in the background of this horror movie. A lot of people during the making of Children of Men thought that the director was being way too ambitious and that these kind of intense horror movie moments were impossible to do as one scene because they have livestock and people running everywhere, and almost every scene is just so visually busy. But he insisted on doing whatever creepy stuff he wanted, and it gives this sci-fi movie a very strange flow for an end of the world apocalypse movie. The Children of Men cast and crew would wake up at 4:30 and begin filming the morning sky in the winter for that cold, depressing dystopian movie lighting, kind of blue and gray instead of the usual red skies of most apocalypse movies. This is the same director of photography as Sleepy Hollow with Johnny Depp, if you like folk horror movies, and I love the way that horror movie looks. There's so many big names in this sci-fi horror movie, but pertaining to the history of horror, Children of Men has the same actress as Hannibal and Carrie in the 90s Psycho remake, which I actually think is a good horror movie, but not as good as the Anthony Perkins sequels. They used handheld cams for a lot of this movie, but it doesn't have that annoying, shaky reality TV effect that a lot of other 2000s horror movies have. Instead, Children of Men looks really smooth and natural. And just going back to amusing stuff hidden in the background, one of the things I always like to watch out for, not just horror films either, is when the dog looks off set for its cue, and the dog's all like, should I just keep standing here, or okay, cool, should I keep looking? Kind of reminds me of Al Bundy's dog. But yeah, there's a lot of social commentary in this movie that's way different than the book if you've ever read Children of Men. This film is very tongue-in-cheek and self-aware, continuously losing the plot and finding it again on purpose. It even directly pokes fun of itself and comes very close to breaking the fourth wall with all of its absurdity.
Whatever your political ideas are, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter.
Oh, come on.
The director said he wanted this movie to be intentionally weird and up to the viewer to decide exactly what it's about. It's also fun and entertaining at the same time for just weird horror movie. There's so many different tone changes that somehow fit together. It's like a horror, drama, romance, comedy set in the sci-fi near future while still remaining like, sci-fi post-apocalyptic horror movies overall. Children of Men is just a strange dystopian movie that's open for interpretation and available for rent on Amazon Prime. Scary Movie 3 is a 2003 horror comedy, and it's entertaining to watch them make fun of other popular 2000s horror movies like The Ring, The Others, even making fun of the M. Night cameo scene from Signs, and the Final Destination movies and Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, which came out in the 2000s. They even very lightly poke fun of the Matrix Reloaded sci-fi sequel, but they cut out a lot of those scenes because I think they were seriously afraid of getting sued. Anyway, the writing team behind this film are not just funny, they're like seriously hilarious. There's 3 of them for Scary Movie 3. One is the writer behind the Naked Gun sequels and Police Academy sequels and that Hot Shots movie, the Top Gun parody with Charlie Sheen, plus Basketball. So already Scary Movie 3 is a horror comedy that has that funny airplane satire timing. And then you have a second writer from the Hangover sequels. And finally, of course, you have Shawn Wayans from Don't Be a Menace. I mean, those are like the funniest parody movies ever made, so of course Scary Movie 3 is going to be really funny. But with that said, and I didn't know this when it first came out, it's a big change up from Scary Movie 1 and Scary Movie 2, which were written by Keenan Ivory and Marlon and Shawn Wayans. A lot of people don't know about the ugly horror history behind the making of Scary Movie 3. When the Wayans brothers were offered the same amount of money to write and direct Scary Movie 3 as Scary Movie 1 and 2, they rejected the deal and were probably expecting a counteroffer. They were replaced. They didn't have the rights to the movie. According to them, the studio still used their script idea for the new writing team. Nobody knew that at the time, and horror movie fans were just happy to watch Scary Movie 3 in the theaters on the big screen. Some more random Making a Scary Movie 3 trivia. They had to redo almost half of this movie, and not because the jokes weren't funny. The new comedy horror writing was too raunchy for PG-13 for some of the test audiences, but they still slipped a lot of weird things into this movie that makes it a fun and entertaining horror movie to watch in a goofy way. The writers couldn't figure out how to end a lot of Scary Movie 3 scenes, so they would just say a bad word or play a funny sound effect and just go to the next one. And they were mad, almost at how well this worked and how hard that would make the test audiences laugh compared to some of their other jokes. They had to rewrite the script at least 3 times. They liked the second draft best, but the third draft is what the producers chose. By the way, even the producers had a good sense of humor with Scary Movie 3. The writers couldn't figure out what to put here during this scene when they were parodying Signs, and the producer turned it into a really funny joke about alien invasion movies. And as with any scary movie in the horror series, the guest cameos are just ridiculous. George Carlin, Charlie Sheen, Method Man, Redman, Macy Gray, Leslie Nielsen's fist-pounding jaw rule. The list goes on. And when they parody 8 Mile, there's early performances from Kevin Hart and that actor Anthony Anderson from that slasher movie Urban Legend. There's Simon Cowell when he still acted like a villain and everybody hated him. Even Jeremy Pivens from that 90s movie PCU is in this horror comedy. So maybe it's my appreciation for Leslie Nielsen movies, or it could just be because SpongeBob's voice actor Tom Kenny gets a couple of lines as an alien when they're parodying Signs.
Please, no. We mean you no harm.
But Scary Movie 3 is one of the better horror movie sequels in this cheesy comedy series. I would personally rank Scary Movie 1 as my favorite in the horror series, just because the Wayans brothers invented the series and they've always been so funny together, you know, ever since In Living Color and stuff like that. But I've heard people say that Scary Movie 3 is one of the few horror movie sequels that's better than the first Scary Movie. And it's not like this is a series that you have to watch in order. You might as well just watch Scary Movie 3 streaming for free on Tubi for that old school horror satire from one of the last good horror movie sequels in the series. Nothing But Trouble is a 1991 horror comedy that anyone who likes weird movies has absolutely got to check out. I don't often call horror movies bizarre, but this is a strange horror comedy that ranks right up there with Wes Craven's People Under the Stairs on the Bizarro meter. Not quite Italian horror movies crazy, but more like way out there for mainstream American horror movies. And the history behind this horror movie is really weird too. Dan Aykroyd and his brother Peter went to see Hellraiser, and his brother wound up writing a horror comedy influenced by Clive Barker's horror movie. And when I look at these weird twins in Nothing But Trouble, who are called Bobo and Lil Devil, I think they were probably based on Cenobites from Hellraiser. Dan Aykroyd was Bobo, by the way, in this movie. And he also was the old monster judge. And based on one time in real life, like a real life horror story, Dan Aykroyd said about when he got pulled over in a small town and basically just like kept there by a judge who wanted to drink tea with him for like 4 to 6 hours. So yeah, it's like that experience and Hellraiser. After the director of An American Werewolf in London and the director of Weird Science both turned down this movie, Dan Aykroyd reluctantly agreed to direct it just to keep the cost down and keep the production moving forward. I guess that means people were taking direction from Dan Aykroyd while he was dressed as these different monsters during all these horror movie scenes. The whole ensemble is like a strange SNL skit gone wrong in the best way. A horror comedy with Chevy Chase and John Candy, Dan Aykroyd, like I said, and Demi Moore. Not to mention that psychedelic funk band Digital Underground that collaborated with Tupac Shakur. They play the same song in this Nothing But Trouble courtroom scene, and it's rad actually. One of the Baldwin brothers is in this movie too. Daniel Baldwin just kind of appears out of nowhere. Nothing But Trouble follows a lot of fun and entertaining B-movie horror rules like excessive travel footage and car chases, getting lost and arriving in a strange mansion after a wrong turn. Weird things like watching you through the walls, which is really more of a 1940s horror movie idea, and absolutely hilarious and absurd one-liners.
Fine, go suck a bug.
Chevy Chase and Demi Moore play the two serious characters, while everyone else is being some kind of exaggerated maniac. The dinner scene, for example, reminded me more of like a horror comedy version of the infamous Texas Chainsaw Massacre dinner scene, which was legitimately terrifying. The best part is, the producers weren't looking after this movie very much because they thought Dan Aykroyd can handle it by himself, and they came back and freaked out when they saw the final product because this is Dan Aykroyd doing whatever weird things he wanted caught on camera. The producers made him cut it down a lot for a PG-13 rating, but the weird stuff was already in there. There was nothing they could do. Nothing But Trouble made $8 million on a $45 million budget, so after this, they pretty much didn't want Dan Aykroyd to direct anymore. This is a wild movie though, and you can go see for yourself on Sling and Plex, where this horror movie is streaming for free. Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, is the 2007 Tim Burton movie filmed with his ex-wife Helena Bonham Carter from Fight Club and his longtime favorite lead actor Johnny Depp, whom Tim Burton had been making horror movies with since Edward Scissorhands in 1990. 5 years before the making of Sweeney Todd, this is a weird piece of horror history, Tim Burton gave Johnny Depp a CD of the Broadway musical Sweeney Todd from the 70s, never intending to make a movie out of it until Helena Carter sort of talked him into doing it. She had wanted to do the musical Sweeney Todd ever since she was 11 years old. Tim Burton, ironically, hates musicals for the most part, which is funny because he helped write Nightmare Before Christmas, one of the best stop-motion horror musical movies of all time. But he really did an outstanding job this time, creating yet another gothic atmospheric horror masterpiece with this movie. This is one of Tim Burton's best movies of all time. Not the best, obviously, but it still holds up. It's fun and entertaining to watch. Johnny Depp as the villain is like a more evil mix of Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands in this role, with a little bit of Jack Skellington, but way more disturbing. This is one of the most brutal and savage movies that Tim Burton has ever made, but also like one of the most lighthearted, very strange contradiction in a good way. He kept telling the Sweeney Todd movie cast not to make exaggerated faces and keep their expressions pretty much still because he was going for a dreary look, neutral, like in gothic horror silent films. Even when the characters are yelling, their faces still stay the same for a more haunting look. They don't really move their eyebrows or anything. It's very strange. Anyway, Sleepy Hollow is one of my favorite gothic horror Tim Burton movies with Johnny Depp. So everybody already knew they could do well together with the dreary British horror film setting, but none of the actors had ever been in a professional musical before. Helena Carter, who has a London accent in real life that's perfect for this film, learned how to sing within 3 months of professional training. And Johnny Depp, who wanted to be a guitarist before becoming an actor, had never sang before and needed musical coaching as well. The song about his blades, called My Friends, was the first time anyone in the Sweeney Todd studio had ever heard his voice. They brought on board the musical composer and lyricist from the Broadway play Stephen Sondheim to supervise, but still both Johnny Depp and Helena Carter found the singing extremely challenging even with the extra help. Not only did Depp have to sing with a British gothic horror movie accent, but some moments during the making of Sweeney Todd he'd have trouble finding and especially holding the longer notes, which could last as long as like 12 measures without losing his breath. Helena Carter had this problem too while singing By the Sea, which is one of my favorite songs in this horror movie because it's so funny the way Johnny Depp just stares off and hates the beach and everything else. This song was also difficult for the Sweeney Todd live Broadway show because there's just no room for taking a breath. Then there's Sacha Baron Cohen's Sweeney Todd performance, which is pretty hilarious. I swear he's just doing Adam Sandler's Opera Man from Saturday Night Live. Every time I watch this movie, I sing You Shave It a Face, You Trim It a Beard to myself for like 3 days after. You also have Alan Rickman from Die Hard, and he's Snape in the Harry Potter movies, and Jane Weisner from Boogeyman 3, underrated horror movie. But above all else, Sweeney Todd is like an awesome slasher movie with creepy dolls and weird masks and all sorts of scary things caught on camera by the same director of photography as Prometheus and Alien Covenant, which weren't the best movies in the Alien series, but still looked cool. Johnny Depp and Tim Burton were so worried about messing up this horror movie because it felt so out of their element, but all of their fears were put aside when the movie won numerous awards and tripled its budget of $50 million at the box office. This is one of the best Tim Burton movies and really kept everyone pretty much amazed at how he could keep cranking out good horror movies for almost 2 decades straight. For fans of Tim Burton movies, or gothic horror, or really even if you don't like musicals at all, Sweeney Todd is still worth checking out on Plex just for the fun, entertaining, and really disturbing slasher movie moments alone. Gremlins is an 80s Christmas horror movie that's one of my favorite, best creature features of all time, most likely the scary movie I've watched the most often throughout my personal goofy life. This horror film has taken over the entire subgenre of Gremlin movies and held on for the past like 40 years. It's Joe Dante's Gremlins. The only other popular 80s horror movie gremlin character besides Gizmo is that airplane gremlin from Spielberg's A Twilight Zone, that scene with John Lithgow. And guess what? That little horror film short segment scene is directed by the same person as this horror movie Gremlins, Joe Dante. Just like his other popular horror movies, Piranha, and one of the best werewolf movies of all time, The Howling, Gremlins is one of those timeless horror films that's a good scary movie in any decade. Gremlins was originally supposed to be a slasher movie that got rewritten and toned way down, turned into more of a funny movie instead, but it still has some disturbing things from the original script, like the Gremlins blender and microwave scenes, and you can see the slasher style in scary movie moments. The mother actress was in the first Scream movie, by the way. The creator of the Gremlins puppets and animatronics, Chris Wallace, was likewise contacted for Gremlins because of his work on The Howling. Fans of the 80s werewolf movies might recognize the same sticker on the refrigerator here and the same newscaster from the Howling movie. It's just one of the many creepy things caught on camera in the background of this horror movie Gremlins. From the animatronics to the stop motion animation horror, everything looks so well done and smooth that it's hard to believe that Gremlins is a horror film that everyone at the time, including Joe Dante, was absolutely certain would be a flop. They had barely contacted Chris Wallace when the production began, and they had to make all of these puppets for Gizmo and the other characters in like under a week. So all of the scenes where the actors are interacting with puppets are actually the early prototypes that were made really fast and often falling apart and breaking. Sometimes the puppets are on marionette strings too for these scenes where they have to be moving. And then they used like classic 50s horror movie effects, like they ran these straws up through the floor to blow air into this puddle to make these bubbles. And for some reason, the cast and crew thought that none of this would look good, but it actually wound up looking great. Way better than anything they expected. In fact, a lot of these scenes, like these scenes right here, are pretty much entirely improv, and they didn't even know what to say until like months after filming, just that they knew they wanted to say something funny here. It was so close to not being a good horror movie just because they were so rushed and had to make all these really complex special effects on no time. Literally about like 4 days before the movie started, they needed a puppet designed and ready to go. So if they're lucky it was even made. They had to film the scenes for Gremlins with the actors first, and then finish putting the puppets together and film just the Gremlins for another 2 months. For example, whenever you see a close-up on like Gizmo's face or any of the other Gremlins, it was this like special 2-foot wide puppet that they had to make later. Altogether, this film took about 5 months, which is a long time for a horror movie. And Joe Dante was in a state of panic the whole time because of all these events. And when the producers came on set for a surprise visit, they found everyone was asleep because the puppet had broke and would be out of service for the day. So everybody just went to sleep. So looking back, it really was an all-star cast and crew from the very beginning of the making of Gremlins. I mean, you have Chris Columbus, writer of The Goonies and director of Home Alone and Miss Doubtfire and a bunch of Harry Potter movies. He got the idea for this movie Gremlins when he would hear rats scampering back and forth in his attic and thought it sounded like some creepy stuff in scary movies. And you get performances from like Corey Feldman and his spontaneous elbow movements that caused the whole thing, if you think about it. And this actress, Polly Holliday, who's Flo in that diner sitcom Alice, she's kind of a villain character in this horror movie, but she's super nice in real life, apparently. And finally, real quick, most people know that Howie Mandel was the voice actor for Gizmo, the good Mogwai gremlin creature, right? Okay. But when Gizmo sings that famous Gremlins song, it's some little girl that Jerry Goldsmith knew from his neighborhood. Jerry Goldsmith wrote the music for The Omen, and he wrote the soundtrack for Gremlins, including this theme song. And he makes a guest appearance in this Gremlins movie scene. Just some weird horror history. Anyway, I could go on about the making of Gremlins all day because there's so much history behind the making of this film, and it truly is one of my favorite classic 80s horror movies of all time. But maybe I'll talk about it more on another horror movie list that has Gremlins 2 on it. I don't know what else. I mean, they changed the color of Gizmo's fur to match the color of the dog and really delayed everything even more. By the way, what a great performance by the dog in Gremlins. Not like that other darn dog in Children of Men. That dog was terrible. He'll never get anywhere in show business. Look at this dog, though. That's some acting. Synchronized puppet takes? My goodness. And Zach Gilligan was in that movie Waxwork. I don't know. Look how cool this background painting is. That's it. That's enough. I gotta stop. Check out Gremlins streaming on YouTube and Amazon Prime.